All right. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Today is May 12th, 2020, and we're here for the dev section group conversation. Sid, looks like you've got the first few questions.
Yeah. Can we maybe consider renaming Gitterly HA since high availability is an outcome? And we've seen a lot of confusion around what's needed to be highly available as GitLab, and not. So sometimes it's necessary to use Gitterly HA, but not always. So maybe we can give it a name that's closer to the feature itself instead of the outcome, something like cluster. I'm not sure about the name.
Yeah, I posted the MR for the release post item for Gitterly HA, where I've asked James that. He's coming back with a few proposals this week. Just out of curiosity, do you have any recommendations or any proposals, Sid, that you think might be more clear?
Yeah. So Redis has a product called Redis Cluster. So that could work. It's also like it's not a complete solution, but calling it even DR would already be an improvement. Although that's still an outcome, still a process. But so it's also a bit. Me personally, I'm a bit confused about what we now call Gitterly HA encompasses. Like I know it's prefect, I know it has failover, but like is it duplicating all the repos and having two servers for everything, or is it also speed improvement?
Yeah.
Is it also a way to shard?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not a way to shard. So let's go to slide 41. Maybe I'll just share my screen for a second. Okay, and everyone see my slides. So I'm on slide 41 if you're in the deck. So this is, I'm just slide this over and make this diagram a bit bigger. So when we say Gitterly HA, it is a bit of a misnomer. So I think we do need to do a better job of the naming. But when we say high availability Gitterly, what we're really talking about is this box that has the dotted line around it, which is really all of these different components that interact with either the GitLab app or course or shell. And so Gitterly, as we all know, is the storage node. So when we're saying Gitterly HA, what we're talking about is the load balancer that sits in front of Prefect, which is our proxy. It's the Prefect tracking database, which stores the replication queue. And it's also the Gitterly clusters underneath here. And then obviously you could have, if you have a shard, this would be kind of the three grade boxes right here. A second shard could be over here. And you can continually add additional clusters to basically increase the performance. So it really is less about performance and more about availability at this point in time. Does that help answer the question, Sid?
Yeah, answers it, and it leads me to believe that cluster might be an appropriate name. Okay.
I think the HA name is one of those that kind of encompasses a methodology, and because we have so many components here, that was kind of why we went with HA Gitterly, but because a cluster is already a thing in the architecture. So I'll have to think about this. I don't know if it's like straightforward. I don't know if ZJ, maybe ZJ or Tim, do you have any thoughts? I know James isn't on the call.
I think it's a good point that part of the HA solution is already a cluster. So I will also need to think about it to figure out if I find a really good name for it that could be better than a cluster. Because yes, if there's even a cluster below it, but we could call the whole thing cluster system, whatever, if this is the most descriptive thing that we find. I think it's also fine.
Well, I'm just throwing something out. Is this available in premium? Is that right? Is that where it becomes available? Just like Gitterly premium or something like that, perhaps tie it to the package that it becomes available in to signal it's a higher end version of the thing.
That's interesting. It's really annoying if we ever move it, but it is a good idea.
Yeah. Or maybe it's, something to indicate it's the superfied version of it that maybe doesn't have much to do with the specifics of what it does.
Yeah, that is interesting. Giving it more of like a marketing name. I think the drawback there is it's less of a call it what it is type of a thing.
Yeah, no.
But it's not a bad idea.
As the marketing person, I actually would encourage HA because it speaks to the benefit, which is like it will always be available. That's what I need to think about this feature, that it will provide me, rather than a name that conveys the idea of how it works internally. I don't care about how it works internally. I need to know what feeling, what benefit I need to attach that name to, and it's that it will be available.
I think those problems Sid's trying to solve here is we don't want smaller customers to feel like it's the only path to high availability. Like normal Gitly is quite highly available for 90% of our customers. That's the challenge. He doesn't want to oversell it because it adds complexity to deployments, and we don't want somebody who doesn't need it to feel like it's the only way they can have a highly available Gitly experience.
I think another interesting point here too, and something we talked about last week, Scott, and I know you've talked to Sid about it, is that we also have Geo High Availability.
Yeah.
So we have a little bit of a messy foo problem here. And that's quite a confusing experience because you have Gitly, then you have Geo, and I think, to the layperson, it's difficult to understand what each of those components are doing and why you would need one to be highly available and not the other, or both to be highly available. So I'll link the docs to that as well.
You could consider the same approach: Geo Premium, Gitly Premium. There's sort of there's a different flavor of it available in those tiers.
Thanks for calling that out, Eric. That's exactly the biggest problem that, I think that fewer than 5% of the people at GitLab are able to explain to you what the difference between Geo HA and Gitly HA are. So that for sure needs to be solved. I have less strong feelings about a Gitly HA after it, but for sure the Geo problem needs to be resolved.
Awesome. Cool, let's go ahead and move on, I guess. So you've got the next question on server runtime.
Yeah, good idea to move on, and feel free to keep me posted. Yeah, you had a slide about it. Maybe you want to talk through it?
Yeah, maybe I'll take the first crack and see if Kai wants to add any color. So last week, GitHub announced a new product called Code Spaces, which is basically a remote dev environment to make changes and run your code in Azure. And it kind of sparked our discussion of what we should be doing in this space, especially with respect to either a more powerful web IDE experience or server-side evaluation. And so we've had a number of brainstorming sessions last week. Sid, you put a nice doc together as well, which is linked in the group conversation agenda. But basically what we're thinking is that we need to be supporting engineers that are working in the web IDE by allowing them to do some sort of runtime. And then we also need to support engineers working locally. And we know that VS Code is eating the world. And so this means really making the GitLab experience better in VS Code. So where do we think we should start? We think we should start with a local VS Code plugin to support GitLab integration. So this would be just simple things like better displaying MRs, pipelines, issues. There's already a GitLab plugin out there that we're working on kind of bringing in to be officially supported. So stay tuned on that. I'll have more information on that the next group conversation. And then once we have that, leverage that plugin to connect to some sort of compute cluster inside of GitLab for application runtime. So that's where we think we should start. And then there's a few relevant epics here if you want to contribute to the conversation. Kai, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you did a good job. I'll say, I think starting at the VS Code plugin, I'll just add on to that, I think is the right place to start. I think if we look at where developers are today, they're working locally. They're not trying to work in a VS Code that's connected online. I think they're working on whatever their local editor is, and VS Code is very popular. And so I think meeting developers there is the right first step in terms of how we better support them when they work inside of GitLab, and then we can expand on that as we go from there.
Cool, thanks for that. Congrats on launching the Jira importer. How has the reception of that been?
Sure, yeah, I can take it. For Gabe, he dropped some notes in there, but he's on a call with a customer. So overall, people are excited that we have it now, and that we're starting to iterate in this direction. We've gotten a lot of great feedback about what we need to do and prioritize for follow-on iterations, and you can see Gabe linked those there. But the short version is, user mapping, description parsing, which also enables pulling in comments. Those are kind of the three big things where we'll start to see a lot of adoption. But we've already seen 24,000 issues imported across about 200 imports and about 80 projects. So super excited so far and excited to see it continue to grow.
Thanks.
Cool, I had the next question. I know enterprise readiness has been a big focus of the team, and for the product as a whole, I know the managed groups specifically have been doing interesting problem validation exercises. I'm wondering if there were any hypotheses that or assumptions that we'd had that were negated, or any interesting insights from that work.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk to this a little bit. I think that this is especially true for the compliance and access groups. They've been especially focused on problem validation with our enterprise customers. And I think the big questions there that we've been trying to kind of answer are kind of run around a number of themes. I think especially around enforcement and how kind of opinionated that we can be about kind of blocking certain actions that users kind of want to enforce. And our position at GitLab is generally, we want to stray away from enforcement as much as possible to make sure that we're not blocking or hampering velocity for our users. And I think so. Matt recently did a great Canvas review on a new direction for required jobs and pipelines. I think that was really insightful and kind of takes us away from that direction that we had before, which was skewing towards kind of enforcement. Matt, I don't know if you can talk a little bit about some of the feedback that you've kind of heard from customers on that kind of direction. And also Melissa's been doing a lot of focused work on kind of understanding group managed accounts, because isolation, I think for enterprises, is definitely a need that we're trying to be cognizant of, with that, while also kind of supporting and making GitLab a flexible open tool for our contributors. So Matt, I don't know if you're willing to kind of speak to that, or Melissa, you can also kind of jump in.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the summary. I think that's very accurate. The concept of required jobs and pipelines has been particularly challenging, and we find that our customers have very strong opinions about how that should exist, and those opinions tend to be very strongly held, kind of counter to our loosely held here at GitLab. But I think some of the key insights have been that we find that we're competing with Jenkins and the Jenkins way of doing things, and that doesn't necessarily mean that's the right way for us to do it. I do want to give a shout out to Jackie Michel, Mike Terrar, and several other folks who have just been totally instrumental in helping me wrap my head around this, helping engage with customers and draw out some of the key insights. Kenny as well has been really helpful. So I think the Opportunity Canvas review was one step closer. I've been having some of these great conversations around what a new proposal might look like, but I feel like we're making progress, and that's what's important. But there's certainly a lot of factors to balance in this particular implementation, given the strong compliance requirements that our customers have and their general unwillingness to budge on how that's implemented.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll just comment. I'm aware of that one, and I was more thinking about maybe where Melissa is headed, which is how we organize users in groups, and if there are like new insights for how enterprises want to do that, that might differ than how our system works today. But yeah, I would say kudos and thank you, Matt, for all your hard work. I know that has been a tricky discussion around required pipelines, and you've done a masterful job of navigating it. So thank you. But yeah, I should have framed it. I was more thinking about, and maybe especially for enterprise git.com usage, if there are new insights for how we organize groups and projects and users that are kind of coming to the surface.
It's okay, I make a comment on this one. We just did a QBR. I'm an SA for named account in US East. So you're right, there's a strong ask from .com perspective. We just closed the deal, maybe make a second largest .com customer for one insurance company. So I know in our 1 year plan to make an enterprise ready, there is a talk to make a group, organizational group, instead of having us, telling customers, set up a group for users and set up a group for projects. So that initiative, that work is extremely welcomed for enterprise customers to organize their resources and teams, then assign those members to different projects. So I would like to track that a little bit more myself for all the top enterprise customers and for their needs. Not only for compliance, but also for planning the jobs and planning the work for the teams. So that's my feedback. And I do want to touch on what Matt has been working on. I think the original issue was created for an account I'm working on right now. And it came from compliance angle, but really when we drew it down, it's a centralized pipeline discussion where enterprises split about, should we have a centralized group for creating pipeline, managing pipeline, or should we link all the dev teams to go create their own pipeline, run their own? So the consensus seemed to be at the enterprise level, they have a center for excellence for DevOps. Then they want to create managed pipelines. Although the initial requirements might be, so from compliance perspective, they want forced or required pipeline jobs. But when you talk to those enterprise customers, really is ability to reuse the pipeline definitions across the whole organization. So one bank say, we only have 12 pipelines, then we go to this insurance company, they say they have 4,000 of them. So there is a balance how the so-called centralized pipeline can be defined, managed, and rolled out to all projects. So at the group level, I think Matt's issue is to define it at the group level. That sounds like a right solution for enterprise.
Yeah, I think you're right on, Jerry. Like that's exactly the problem that Matt is trying to solve without being overly opinionated and slowing down kind of progress of these large organizations, but also creating kind of a centralized way for them to manage using groups without having to specify pipelines on a project by project basis. So
yeah,
I'm glad to hear that makes some sense to you.
Yeah, and it becomes much less opinionated when you step away just to say it's a security or compliance requirement. That is a net result, and you achieve that, but that's not necessarily the actual core requirement. The requirement we heard really is there a way to centralize the pipeline definition and managing it, and then dev team focus on coding, focus on innovation rather than get bogged down by pipeline definition. That's another angle we heard about it.
Cool. Kenny, I added a link below there for you that was something Gabe has championed, and he isn't here, but I thought it might be interesting to read about. It's sort of in the vein of like organizational constructs with sort of breaking our current group and project model and how we might rethink that in a way that like is more flexible for some customers in the way they organizationally like lay things out across the group.
Yeah, Gabe just joined one of the calls with us last Friday for one of the banks. So there are some interesting discussions from that. Not necessarily specific on organizational structure, but leading into workflow. Should you enforce the workflow? How do you work with that? And there is a specific compliance requirement on the workflow job. How do you deal with that? So he got a good insight there.
Yeah, I have a proposal. I think that our current group structure with subgroups, like it's superior to any other product in the market. It's just that people don't want to use it for teams. So the only thing we have to do is say, oh, you have teams now too in GitLab, and we just create a group and we turn issues and wiki and everything off in that, so you don't get any functionalities, just a namespace. We already have the ability to turn everything off. So this is just a very easy cosmetic change that will resolve like a ton of these problems, and then they can just invite those teams to all the groups. It's a way we recommend, but because we don't call it teams, everyone is confused. So let's think about a really small technical space, because we've been going back and forth with workplaces and spaces and stuff like that. We don't need to engineer anything. It's just confusion, and we can just solve that by giving it a different name and turning all the stuff off by default.
Totally agree. That's how we positioned it when we walk through user group level structure, because a lot of enterprise customers, when we get them into POC.
Melissa, I wasn't sure. Do you want to voice over your SSO bullet? I think that one actually is pretty interesting.
Yeah, so just to recap what I've been focusing on, I've been focusing on basically where do enterprises wanna, that are on .com, what do they wanna keep basically separate from other customers, and basically what are their concerns with how things are working now, and really understanding what their basically what their problems are, and to figure out, you know, what's the way that we can solve it and also keep kind of like a developer friendly environment. So that's kind of what I've been looking at, more on the aspects of privacy, not so much on the aspects of how do you structure groups and teams yet. And the other thing that I've been looking at is just for those customers that want to take advantage of some of the existing features, how can we make setup easy? And one of the ways is creating apps for some of the major providers. So now we have more data about you know, what providers people are using, and we're starting now creating apps so that setup is really easy. We created the Okta Skim app that was released recently, and now we're moving on to the SSO portion.
Yeah, to circle back to your question, Kenny, I haven't heard of any kind of new insights that invalidate kind of like how we already have groups and subgroups structured in GitLab. I think that there are iterative improvements that we need to make that, like Melissa just touched on, that are related to privacy and isolation. Like the access group right now is working on a change that allows you to modify how inheritance works in subgroups. So you're able to create subgroups that don't inherit all of the members from previous groups for some customers. This is like an iterative improvement that we can make to kind of like how subgroups already work, but there's nothing that I've heard that invalidates kind of like our current path. The main needs that we hear from customers are, how can I make sure that, you know, I have my you know, certain group activity that's controlled and remains private, and also that, especially for GitLab.com, that group owners have control and the ability to manage and admin the users and employees in their groups. And those are both problems that Melissa is very focused on solving.
Great, thanks.
Thanks for the question, Kenny. John, I think you've got the next and probably last question.
Thanks, Eric. I just wanted to ask about the WYSIWYG editor implementation. Pretty exciting stuff. I think that'll be helpful to a lot of the GitLab team. So I just wanted to know what that implementation was going to look like, and then, you know, whether we'll need to update certain parts of our handbook in addition to docs and things when this change goes into effect.
Yeah, I took some notes in there. I can take that one, Eric. I'll go quickly. I wrote a lot of notes in here, and I also misinterpreted. I think I was going more for technical details, and you were actually, I think, maybe asking about what changes to the content of the handbook. So I can touch on both. It's important to note that in 13.0, we won't have the WYSIWYG editor available for the handbook yet, but we're working towards that. That is our goal by the end of the quarter. And once we do, we will certainly be editing the handbook content to reflect how easy it is and how to use that editor and what kinds of content may not be available to be edited yet and what kinds of content would be ideal for edits using the WYSIWYG editor. Technically on the detail side, we're using a third-party editor, and just to touch on some of the feedback there, we're as we get closer to integrating it with the handbook, we're really focused on making sure that we have the right kind of configuration so that the resulting MRs from the WYSIWYG editor will not fail our linting rules. They'll be using the proper styling and markdown syntax. And yeah, the editor is opt-in, so you don't have to use the WYSIWYG editor. You can use your web IDE edits just as you would before, and there's also a raw markdown editor built into the static site editor as well. There's a little more detail in the notes there, but I know we're at time.
Do we intend to have this available in the web IDE at some point as well?
No, it's a separate feature, and it would be configured separately for static sites specifically, and it won't overlap with the web IDE, at least right now.
Hey team, we are at time for this call. I hate to cut anyone off. It sounds like we're really having great conversation, but we do have another AMA scheduled in the next 5 minutes. So
thank you for keeping us on track. We appreciate that. And thanks for the great questions, everyone. Have a great day.
have a great day.